History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Culture. Chapter 7 Imperial China. Well before this, Taoism had developed into a mystical cult, borrowing something from Buddhism in the process, appealing both to those who sought personal immorality and to those who felt the appeal of a quietistic movement as an outlet from the growing complexity of Chinese life. As such, it would have enduring significance. Its recognition of the subjectivity of human thought gives it an appearance of humility, which some people in different cultures with more aggressive intellectual attitudes find attractive today. Such religious and philosophical notions, important as they were, touched the life of the peasant directly, only a little more than Confucianism, except in debased forms. A prey to the insecurities of war and famine, his outlet lay in magic and superstition. What little can be discerned of his life suggests that it was often intolerable, sometimes terrible. A significant symptom is the appearance under the Han of peasant rebellion, a phenomenon which became a major theme of Chinese history, punctuating it almost as rhythmically as the passing of dynasties. Oppressed by officials acting either on behalf of an imperial government seeking taxes for its campaigns abroad or in their own interest as grain speculators. The peasants turned to secret societies, another recurrent theme. Their revolts often took religious forms. A millenarian, Macanian strain has run through Chinese Revolution, bursting out in many guises, but always positing a world dualistically divided into good and evil, the righteous and the demons. Sometimes this threatened the social fabric, but the peasants were rarely successful for long. Chinese society therefore changed very slowly. In spite of some important cultural and administrative innovations, the lives of most Chinese were for centuries little altered in style, appearance, or reality. The comings and goings of the dynasties were accounted for by the notion of the mandate of heaven. And although great intellectual achievements were possible, China's civilization already seemed self contained, self sufficient, stable to the point of immobility. No innovation compromised the fundamentals of a society more closely woven into a particular governmental structure than anything in Europe. This structure proved quite competent to contain such changes as did take place and to regulate them so as not to disturb the traditional forms. One visibly important change was a continuing growth of commerce and towns, which made it easier to replace labor service by taxation. Such new resources could be tapped by the government both to rule larger areas effectively and to provide a series of great material monuments. They had already permitted the Qin to complete the Great Wall, which later dynasties were further to extend, sometimes rebuilding portions of it. It still astonishes the observer and far outranks the wall of Hadrian and Antoninus. Just before the inauguration of the Tang, too, at the other end of this historical epoch, a great system of canals was completed which linked the lower Yangtze Valley and its rice growing areas with the Yellow River Valley to the north as far as Hangzhou to the south. Millions of laborers were employed on this and on other great irrigation schemes. Such works are comparable in scale with the pyramids and surpass the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. They imposed equally heavy social costs too, and there were revolts against conscription for buildings and guard duties. It was a state with great potential and a civilization with impressive achievements already to its credit, which entered its mature phase in 618. For the next 1,000 years, as for the previous 800, its formal development can be linked to the comings and goings of dynasties, which provide a chronological structure. Tang 618 to 907, Sung 960 to 1126, Mongol ascendancy 1234 to 1368, Ming 1368 to 1644, Manchu or Qing 1644 to 1912. Many historical themes overrun these divisions. One is the history of population. There was an important shift of the demographic center of gravity towards the south during the Tang period. Henceforth, most Chinese were to live in the Yangtze Valley rather than the Yellow River Plain. The devastation of the southern forests and exploitations of new lands to grow rice fed them. But new crops became available too. Together, they made possible an overall growth of population which accelerated under the Mongols and the Ming. Estimates have been made that the population of perhaps 80 million in the 14th century more than doubled in the next 200 years, so that in 1600 there were about 160 million subjects of the empire. This was a huge number given populations elsewhere, but there was still great increase to come. The weight of this fact is great. Apart from the enormous potential importance it gives to China in world population history, it puts in perspective the great manifestations of Chinese culture and imperial power, which rested on the huge mass of desperately poor peasants utterly unconcerned with such things. For the most part, their lives were confined to their villages. Only a few could hope to escape from this, or can have envisaged doing so. Most could have dreamed only of obtaining the precarious but best security available to them, the possession of a little land. Yet this became more and more difficult as numbers grew and gradually all available land was occupied. It was farmed more and more intensively in smaller and smaller plots. The one way out of the trap of famine was rebellion. At a certain level of intensity and success, this might win support from the gentry and officials, whether from prudence or sympathy. When that happened, the end of a dynasty was probably approaching. For Confucian principles taught that, although rebellion was wrong, if a true king reigned, a government which provoked rebellion and could not control it ought to be replaced, for it was ipso facto illegitimate. At the very end of this road lay the success of a 20th century Chinese revolution based on the peasants. For many centuries, population pressure, a major fact of modern China's history, made itself felt to the authorities only in indirect and obscured ways, when, for instance, famine or hunger drove men to rebellion. A much more obvious threat came from the outside. Essentially, the problem was rather like that of the Rome, an overlong frontier beyond which lay barbarians. Tang influence over them was weakened when Central Asia succumbed to Islam. Like their Roman predecessors, too, the later Tang emperors found that reliance on soldiers could be dangerous. There were hundreds of military rebellions by local warlords under the Tang, and any rebellion's success, even if short lived, had a multiplier effect, tending to disrupt administration and damage the irrigation arrangements on which food and therefore internal peace depended. A regime thought of as a possible ally by Byzantium, which had sent armies to fight the Arabs and received ambassadors from Harun al Rashid, was potentially a great world power. In the end, though, unable to police their frontier effectively, the Tang underwent in the 10th century, and China collapsed again into political chaos. The Sung Empire, which emerged from it, had to face an even graver external threat, the Mongols, and were in due course swallowed after the barbarian dynasty which had evicted them from North China had itself been engulfed by the warriors of Chinggis Khan. During the whole of this period, the continuity and recuperative power of the bureaucracy and the fundamental institutions of society kept China going and were particularly exploited by the first Sung emperors. As after earlier dynastic change, the inheritors of power continued to turn to existing officialdom. An estimate for the 18th century gives less than 30,000 civil and military officers actually in post. They thus drew into the service of each new government the unchanging values of Confucian system, which were strengthened if narrowed by disaster. Although the origins of the examination system of recruitment to the bureaucracy went back to Han times, it was under the Song that it was established as a major feature of the government. Only a small number of specially crucial matters were ever expected to be the reserved province of the imperial government. Confucian teaching supported this distinction of spheres of action and made it easy for a dynasty to be displaced without compromising the fundamental values and structure of society. A new dynasty would have to turn to the officials for its administration and to the gentry for most of its officials who, in their turn, could get some things done only on the gentry's terms. Recurrent disunity did not prevent China's rulers, sages, and craftsmen from bringing Chinese civilization to its peak in 1000 years after the Tang inauguration. Some have placed the classical age as early as the 7th and 8th centuries under the Tang themselves, while others discern it under the Song. Such judgments usually rest on the art forms considered, but even Song artistic achievement was in any case a culmination of development begun under the Tang, between whom the Han, much more of a break in style, had been apparent. It was, in fact, the most important break in the continuity of Chinese art until this century. Tang culture reflects the stimulus of contacts with the outside world, but especially with Central Asia, unprecedentedly close under this dynasty. The capital was then at Chang'an in Shaanxi, a western province. Its name means long lasting peace, and to this city at the end of the Silk Road came Persians, Arabs, and Central Asians who made it one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the world. It contained Nestorian churches, Zoroastrian temples, Muslim mosques, and was probably the most splendid and luxurious capital of its day, as the objects which remain to show us. Many of them reflect Chinese recognition of styles other than their own. The imitation of Iranian silverware, for example, while the flavor of a trading entrepot is preserved in the pottery figures of horsemen and loaded camels, which reveal the life of Central Asia swirling in the streets of Chang'an. These figures were often finished with the new polychromatic glazes achieved by Tang potters. Their style was imitated as far away as Japan and Mesopotamia. The presence of the court was an important factor in stimulating such craftsmanship as the visits of merchants from abroad and from tomb paintings. Something of the life of the court aristocracy can be seen. The men relax in hunting, attended by Central Asian retainers. The women, vacuous in expression, are luxuriously dressed and, if servants, elaborately equipped with fans, cosmetic boxes, back scratchers, and other paraphernalia of the boudoir. Great ladies, too, favor Central Asian styles borrowed from their domestic staff. The history of women, though, is the history of one of those other China's always obscured by the bias of the documentation towards the official culture. We hear little of them even in literature except in sad little poems and love stories. Yet, presumably, they must have made up about half of the population, or perhaps slightly less, for in hard times, girl babies were exposed by poor families to die. That fact perhaps characterizes women's place in China until very recent times, even better than the more familiar and superficially striking practice of foot binding, which produced grotesque deformations and could leave a high born lady almost incapable of walking. Another China, still all but excluded from the historical evidence by the nature of the established tradition, was that of the peasants. They become shadowly visible only as numbers in the census returns and as eruptions of revolt. After the Han pottery figures, there is little in Chinese art to reveal them, and certainly nothing to match the uninterrupted and often idealized recording of the life of the common man in the fields, which runs from medieval European illumination through the vernacular literature to the Romantics and into the peasant subjects of the early Impressionists. Official culture also excluded the tenth or so of the Chinese population who lived in the cities, some of which grew as time passed to become the biggest in the world. Chang'an, when the Tang capital, is said to have had 2 million inhabitants. No 18th century European city was as big as contemporary Canton or Peking, which were even larger. Such huge cities housed societies of growing complexity. Their development fostered a new commercial world. The first Chinese paper money was issued in 650. Prosperity created new demands, among other things, for a literature which did not confine itself to the classical models and, in colloquial style, far less demanding than the elaborate classical Chinese. City life thus gradually secreted a literature alternative to the official culture, and because it was literate, it is the first part of unofficial China to which we have some access. Such popular demand could be satisfied because of two enormously important inventions, that of the paper in the 2nd century BC and of the printing before 700 AD. This derived from the taking of rubbed impressions from stone under the Han. Printing from wood blocks was taking place under the Tang, and movable type appeared in the 11th century AD. Soon after this, large numbers of books were published in China, long before they appeared anywhere else in the cities. 2. Flourished popular poetry and music which abandoned the classical tradition. The culture of Chang'an never recovered from its disruption by rebellion in 756, only 2 years after the foundation of an imperial academy of letters, about 900 years before any similar academy in Europe. After this, the Tang dynasty was in decline. The Sung ascendancy produced more great pottery. The northern phase of Sung history was marked by work still in colored pattern tradition, while southern Song craftsmen came to favor monochromatic, simple products. Significantly, they attached themselves to another tradition, that of the forms evolved by the great bronze casters of early China. For all the beauty of its ceramics, though, Sung is more notable for some of the highest achievements of Chinese painting, their subject matter being, above all, landscape. As a phase of Chinese development, though the Song era is more remarkable still for a dramatic improvement in the economy. In part, this can be attributed to technological innovation. Gunpowder, movable type, and the stern post all can be traced to the Song era, but it was also linked to the exploitation of technology already long available. Technological innovation may indeed have been as much a symptom as a cause of a surge in economic activity between the 10th and 13th centuries, which appears to have brought most Chinese a real rise in incomes in spite of continuing population growth. For once in the pre modern world, economic growth seems for a long period to have outstripped demographic trends. One change making this possible was certainly the discovery and adoption of a rice variety which permitted two crops a year to be taken from well irrigated land and one from hilly ground, only watered in the spring. The evidence of rising production in a different sector of the economy has been dramatically distilled into one scholar's calculation that within a few years of the Battle of Hastings, China was producing nearly as much iron as the whole of Europe 6 centuries later. Textile production too underwent dramatic development, notably through the adoption of water driven spinning machinery. And it is possible to speak of Sung industrialization as a recognizable phenomenon. It is not easy, the evidence is still disputed, to say why this remarkable burst of growth took place. Undoubtedly, there was a real input to the economy by public, that is, governmental investment in public works, above all, communications. Prolonged periods of freedom from foreign invasion and domestic disorder also must have helped, though the second benefit may be explained as much by economic growth as the other way round. The main explanation, though, seems likely to be an expansion in the markets and the rise of a money economy which owed something to factors already mentioned, but which rested fundamentally on a great expansion in agricultural productivity. So long as this kept ahead of population increase, all was well. Capital became available to utilize more labor and to tap technology by investment in machines. Real incomes rose. It is even harder to say why, after temporary and local regression at the end of Song era and the resumption of economic growth, this intensive growth, which made possible rising consumption by great numbers, came to an end. Nonetheless, it did and was not resumed. Instead, average real incomes in China stabilized for something like 5 centuries, as production merely kept pace with population growth. After that time, incomes began to fall and continued to do so to a point at which the early 20th century Chinese peasant could be described as a man standing neck deep in water, whom, when ripples could drown. But the economic relapse after Song times is not the only factor to be taken into account in explaining why China did not go on to produce a dynamic, progressive society. In spite of printing, the mass of Chinese remained illiterate down to the present century. China's great cities, for all their growth and commercial vitality, produced neither the freedom and impunities which sheltered men and ideas in Europe, nor the cultural and intellectual life which in the end revolutionized European civilization, nor effective questioning of the established order. Even in technology, where China achieved so much so soon, there is similar strange gap between intellectual fertility and revolutionary change. The Chinese could invent, they had a far more efficient wheelbarrow than other civilizations. But once Chow times were over, it was the use of new land and the introduction of new crops rather than technical change which raised production. Other examples of a low rate of innovation are even more striking. Chinese sailors already had the magnetic compass in Sung times, but though naval expeditions were sent to Indonesia, the Persian Gulf, Aden, and East Africa in the 15th century, their aim was to impress those places with the power of the Ming. not to accumulate information and experience for further voyages of exploration and discovery. Masterpieces had been cast in bronze in the second millennium BC, and the Chinese knew how to cast iron 1500 years before the Europeans. Yet, much of the engineering potential of this metallurgical tradition was unexplored, even when iron production rose so strikingly. What he called a sort of black stone was burnt in China when Marco Polo was there. It was coal, but there was to be no Chinese steam engine. This list could be much lengthened. Perhaps the explanation lies in the very success of Chinese civilization in pursuit of a different goal, the assurance of continuity and the prevention of fundamental change. Neither officialdom nor the social system favored the innovator. Moreover, pride in the Confucian tradition and the confidence generated by great wealth and remoteness made it difficult to learn from outside. This was not because the Chinese were intolerant. Jews, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrian Persians, and Arab Muslims long practiced their own religion freely, and the last even made some converts, creating an enduring Islamic minority. Contacts with the West multiplied too, later under Mongol rule. But what has been called a Neo Confucian movement was by then already manifesting tendencies of defensive hostility, and formal tolerance had never led to much receptivity in Chinese culture. Invasion by the Mongols showed China's continuing seductive power over its conquerors. By the end of the 13th century, all China had been overrun by them, and this may have cost the country something like 30 million lives, or well over a quarter of its whole population in 1200. But the center of gravity of the Mongol Empire had moved from the steppes to Peking, Kublai's capital. This grandson of Genghis was the last of the great Khans, and after this his time, Mongol China can be considered Chinese, not Mongol. Kublai adopted a dynastic life in 1271, and the remainder of the Mongol era is recorded as that of Yuan dynasty. China changed the Mongols more than the Mongols changed China, and the result was the magnificence reported by the amazed Marco Polo. Kublai made a break with the old conservatism of the steppes, the distrust of civilization and its works, and his followers slowly succumbed to Chinese culture in spite of their initial distrust of the scholar officials. They were, after all, a tiny minority of rulers in an ocean of Chinese subjects. They needed collaborators to survive. Kublai spent nearly all his life in China, though his knowledge of Chinese was poor. But the relationship of Mongol and Chinese was long ambiguous. Like the British in 19th century India, who set up social conventions to prevent their assimilation by their subjects. So the Mongols sought by positive prohibition to keep themselves apart. Chinese were forbidden to learn the Mongol language or to marry Mongols. They were not allowed to carry arms. Foreigners, rather than the Chinese, were employed in administration where possible, a device paralleled in the western khanates of the Mongol Empire. Marco Polo was for 3 years an official of the Great Khan. A Nestorian presided over the Imperial Bureau of Astronomy. Muslims from Transoxiana administered Yunnan. For some years, the traditional examination system was also suspended. Some of the persistent Chinese hostility towards the Mongols may be explained by such facts, especially in the south. When Mongol rule in China collapsed, 70 years after Kublai's death, there appeared an even more exaggerated respect for tradition and a renewed distrust of foreigners among the Chinese ruling class. The short run achievement of the Mongols was nonetheless very impressive. It was most obvious in the re-establishment of China's unity and the realization of its potential as a great military and diplomatic power. The conquest of the Song South was not easy, but once it was achieved in 1279, Kublai's resources were more than doubled. They included an important fleet, and he began to rebuild the Chinese sphere of influence in Asia. Only in Japan was he totally unsuccessful. In the south, Vietnam was invaded, Hanoi was captured 3 times, and after Kublai's death, Burma was occupied for a time. These conquests were not, it is true, to prove long lasting, and they resulted in tribute rather than prolonged occupation. In Java, too, success was qualified. A landing was made there and the capital of the island taken in 1292, but it proved impossible to hold. There was also further development of the maritime trade with India, Arabia, and the Persian Gulf, which had begun under the Song.